There's this quote that's a man never steps in the same river twice, something
I
along
like
those
that.
lines, right? And it's like every single offseason, that athlete is going to
Different.
be slightly different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I'm going to be slightly different, or
Mm-hmm.
our timeline of things is going to be different. Some variable will have changed. So I think you hit the nail on the head there in that, like, we should constantly be auditing what we're doing and not just regurgitating the same early off-season program every single year. And this is what starts us this is what's going to start my baseball offseason in
Mm-hmm.
August every year, right? Is this same
Yeah.
4 week block. Well, that's great. I'm glad that worked for you at one point,
Yep.
but are we intentionally,
Mm-hmm.
sort of like deploying that program and implementing it, or are we just doing it because it worked once and we haven't really audited whether it's continued to work?
Okay, welcome back to this week's episode of the MTV Performance Project. On this week's episode, we have Sean Smith. Sean, thanks for being here, brother.
Yeah, appreciate it. Super excited to have a chat with you today, and really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, we were kindly introduced through a mutual friend, Jamie Pasco, and a previous guest. So glad he was able to connect us in terms of getting you on. So
Yeah, Jamie's the man. I think we were talking a little bit off air. He and I were we were in the trenches together as interns. So he's the man, and I appreciate him connecting us.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I know like I've done like a little bit of like a deep dive into like your past and some of your stuff on social media. Like you got some great stuff on there, and you got a pretty diverse background. But tell us a little bit how you got initially involved in the world of strength and conditioning.
Yeah, I mean, very, very typical. I was an athlete. I've played a bunch of different sports growing up, but I knew that that was not going to make me a living. And I fell in love with the process of training because I was not the most physically gifted. So I was doing everything I could, but yeah, I think it's a pretty traditional career um, trajectory for me as well. I interned, I mentioned with Jamie, I interned at a bunch of different places, both at the high school level, but also at the NCAA level. Kind of worked my way up or climbed the rungs on the ladder, as an intern into a fellow or a GA type position, into a full, kind of an assistant full time position, and then to a more senior level role at the University of Louisville, and then the last couple of years, I have basically been the head of performance for a uh, professional motorsport team in IndyCar, and what that role entailed really was everything health and performance for the drivers, the pit crew, and there was an aspect of corporate wellness or organizational health and performance as well. So it was pretty unique opportunity, and that's kind of what pulled me away from my position at the University of Louisville, which was awesome, being from Louisville originally. And then just recently, here back in February, my wife works in sport as well, which is it can always be a challenge to kind of find something full time in the same place. But she got an awesome opportunity out here in San Diego as a head of nutrition role, and so we packed everything up, drove out here back in February, and now we're stationed in sunny Southern California.
Very nice. Nice change of scenery, I'm sure, from Midwest to sunny San Diego. So
Yeah, gray for 5, 6, 7 months of the year to gray for I think a couple of weeks out here. So I'll make that trade any day.
yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, I mean, based on that's a very diverse background. You go from collegiate, team sport training on like a very high level, coming from Michigan, and then Louisville. Like they've got amazing programs, and they've got a ton of athletes. I'm sure you dealt with, and then going to motorsport. Like that's got to be a pretty big jump. Tell us kind of like some of the foundations that you learned through your evolution through collegiate sport that kind of helped lend you to being successful in the motorsport world.
Yeah, I think kind of regardless of what position, my philosophy really has always been to just try and meet the athlete where they're at, right? Like if we're as strength and conditioning or physical preparation coaches, performance coaches, whatever you want to term it, right? If we are trying to impact that athlete's performance on their field of play or on the court, whatever it may be, To me, you really need to start with them and try and understand what is actually going to help them and what do they want to achieve. And so for me, it is very much athlete centered and then being performance focused. So you can take a really typical kind of needs analysis approach of the sport and then the position and then individualizing for the athlete. But I really find that starting with the athlete first, as best you can, you don't always get that luxury in the NCAA environment or in an environment where you're dealing with high number of athletes, high head count. But yeah, for me, I think that's been the biggest thing, right? Is just trying to build a relationship with the athlete, or anybody else that maybe is impacting that athlete's performance and their journey as an athlete as well, whether that be coaches in motorsport, that might be the engineer or the team manager, whoever that may be, and really trying to bring those pieces together and try and get everybody at a seat at the table so that we can all discuss how this is actually going to work and what does success look like. I think that's been the biggest thing that has, if we're gonna say I've been successful, I would appreciate that. That's great. But yeah, I think that's been the biggest thing that I've learned along the way from every single environment that I've worked in is that you really got to put that person first.
Meeting, like you said, meeting those athletes where they're at and putting them first. How would you say, what are maybe some of the biggest like dynamics that are different from collegiate sport to like, I mean, obviously professional motorsports, that's on a, people are getting paid to do this. It's like their livelihood. Not that collegiate sports isn't much different nowadays. Um, but how do you, from a contextual standpoint, how did you, what was like the biggest difference there, or what are some of the things that you took from your collegiate experience that was able to make you successful at the professional level that you can operationalize? So,
Yeah, again, I think it is, and I'll say the athletes were not getting paid in the NCAA when I was there. So
Yeah.
it is times have definitely changed.
yeah.
I would say motorsport in and of itself is highly unique as well because the demands of that sport are so vastly different. It's extremely physical. There's a large mental component as there is with every athlete, but in particular with that sport and those types of athletes, the mental component is really, really critical from, just even how we manage that, those athletes' headspace during a race weekend. And I think in terms of, I guess, what I've learned and can kind of operationalize, again, it's the process of how we basically build a program or try and influence or impact performance, right? And so again, I mentioned this earlier, it's right, we do want to start with that athlete first. We've got to try and have an understanding of the sport. So that's something that I take very seriously and I try and be very intentional of is trying to understand the sport and trying to ask the athlete, what are they perceiving? What do they feel like matters for their sport? And then we're going to add that in as best we can to the program, right? Assuming that it makes sense. We're not just going to do things for things sake, but I really want to make sure that the athlete is has some autonomy in this process, and they also have, I mentioned, a seat at the table earlier. They also have a seat at the table because they are ultimately the one that's going out and they are competing, right? So again, that process is really, really focused on starting with the athlete first and then kind of building things out from there.
And so essentially what you're trying to do is just through those conversations, building better contexts as to, because not everybody understands what it's like to be in a race car, right? You
Right.
can you can go out and play pickup basketball and pick up volleyball and gain some level of context, but in a race car drive, like you can't. It's from a liability standpoint, that's you
Right.
can't
Yeah.
really do that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And I had a similar conversation recently with another coach and practitioner, and I said like I almost have to be solely reliant on a racing driver to understand that, right? If I'm working with volleyball players, and I have for the last few years, for me, I can go, I can go play a bit of pickup, beach volleyball or even indoor or wherever, right? I can, uh, you know, I mean, I did this at Louisville is try and have those coaches work with me on some things so I have a better understanding of, what maybe that feels like, or even just kind of the feel of, what that athlete may be perceiving on court, right? You can't do that in a race car. And a simulator only gets you so far, right? I've hopped in a sim, but it's a bit like playing a video game. It's very high level, but it doesn't give you the same feel that a real car would, and on track and all these things. So I think I am, again, heavily reliant on learning from the athletes and understanding, or trying to understand as best I can, their experience so that we can really try and assist them and support them as best as I can from my position, and what I can actually influence.
So just being super curious and just, ask a lot of questions and listen more than you talk, so to speak. So
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
yeah. No, I agree with that 100% because I work with a ton of baseball players. That was my sport, and I always believe that the time I spent playing the game has really helped inform me from just a physical, mental, cultural standpoint, like being able to meet baseball athletes really where they are. Um, in past 5, 10 years, I've worked with more football quarterbacks and things like that. And so in an effort to glean more information and better context like I have with baseball, I started doing, quarterback training and skill work and things like that. And I feel like it's only helped inform my ability to work with quarterbacks because like you said, like you need to have some context and understanding of where they're at. But without that, like there's no common language. There's no understanding of where the athlete, like, biggest challenges are. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and you didn't explicitly mention this, but I think, like, your experience as an athlete, right, in baseball, and the analogous learning that you can have from taking something like baseball and applying it to a different sport, whether that be a quarterback, even a softball player, a basketball player, whoever that may be. I think there's a massive opportunity that, frankly, is a bit untapped in many cases from sports trying to learn from other sports. And there's a common argument like, oh, well, a volleyball player is not a basketball player, or a quarterback's not a pitcher, or whatever. And that's true, like, they're not. But I think that doesn't mean you can't learn from other sports. And so, I think analogous learning is really important. So, I have to imagine your experience as a baseball player is really helpful when you are both training baseball players, but also other sports as well.
Yeah, I think the foundation, look, we're dealing with human bodies. So from a biomechanical standpoint and just a physiological standpoint, there's a lot of similarities that you can extrapolate information based off of previous experience. But like you said, the getting on a very contextual level, understanding, things from a specific standpoint, it takes a lot of, if you don't have firsthand knowledge, you got to talk to the athletes. You got to have that communication and understanding like, hey, where do you feel the biggest limitation? Help me understand so I can create some context and build a better program for you and ultimately bridge that gap to where you're trying to build performance. So,
Yeah, 100%. And I think trying to, you know, not just the athlete, but the coaches. This is a big thing for me when I was at Louisville, is trying to understand, how coaches want the athletes to play the game, right? Both tactically, but also technically in a sense. And, having a trying to gain, what they perceive to be successful for the athletes as well, right? Because I think it is important to involve the athlete in that process, but you've also, like, I mentioned seats at the table earlier, right? I want to have the athlete there. I want to have the coach, whether that be a head coach or a positional coach, whatever that may be, and really try and bring those uh pieces together, and from my own standpoint, be very curious in asking them, what does success look like for them, and how am I going to do my part to actually, try and get us there, right? Or help get us there. And I think it's really, really important to again, try and understand the context of the sport and try and understand what people are perceiving, and what they anticipate, or what they want success to look like.
yeah, I love that you had mentioned, obviously getting input and feedback from the athlete, but also from their coaches, right? Because that's also very important in terms of, right, like as a coach, what are you looking for from this athlete? What do you see as potential limitations? And I think that team approach is just going to continually help the athlete evolve and develop long term. So,
Yeah, man, I agree 100%. And, I think there's a lot of people out there, if I'm being honest, and, my opinion is there's a lot of people out there that are talking about those things, but then, you know, exclusive to the weight room or just the physical preparation side, and they're leaving skill on the table, right? So as a strength and conditioning coach, they're not going out and trying to better understand um, the skill that is needed, right? Or the tactics of the game, or motor learning, and in a lot of these areas that really help to bridge the gap, right? The weight room is one piece of it, and it's super important, and I'm have to say that because I'm a strength and conditioning coach.
yeah,
But I think it's not enough to just be really good at the weight room, right? I think you've got to understand why we're doing what we're doing in the weight room, and how that actually transfers, right? Or not just the weight room, but any sort of physical prep, whether that be speed work, agility work, any of that sort of stuff, and how that's actually meant to better prepare the athlete for the situation that they're going to see in a match or in competition.
yeah, that's so true. So true. And I think that's where a lot of strength coaches become limited because they're just either they don't want to see that or they're not capable of doing it. So love that. I mean that kind of segues nicely into our my next question. I think you talk a lot about importance of in-season training and things like that. And I know you work with a lot of volleyball athletes. I actually have two nieces who played like high-level collegiate and professional volleyball, and I was always amazed at like they have no real off season. Like very compared to like a football player or a baseball player that I'm used to. Like you have a very limited window to work with them in an off season standpoint. So from your standpoint, working with these athletes who do have such a narrow off season, like what are some of the things you do to help navigate the development of physical qualities in and out of competitive schedules?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is it's really contextual to the athlete and the level at which they're playing at, right? So, I got to be honest. When I was in the collegiate environment and working with Louisville, we had a massive off season, right? It was like January. I mean, there's a spring season in there, but we always trained hard through that, right? So our off season is January to middle of August, right? So I mean, we're training. That's months and months and months worth of training to kind of build some of these qualities that allow us to actually um, be able to train harder in season, or back off when we really need to, because we're not going to lose those qualities. So, that environment, and it took time to get there. I'll say this, I that's not some like master class by me. We had an amazing coaching staff that was really bought in on, you know, trying to get all of these pieces, strength and conditioning, sports science, nutrition, sports medicine, all of these pieces, and get those things working together, because they saw the impact that it was going to have for the athletes and that program. So I was really fortunate. That's not like, again, some master class by me on really doing a good job in the off season. I did as best I could. But I had a lot of support, and I had a lot of really good practitioners that I worked with on the health and performance side of things. And so for them, it becomes very easy, right? You have a really long off season. Um, I also was pretty fortunate that I didn't have a massive athlete load. And so I was able to do quite a bit of individualization, or at least positional, um, you know, position specific work with that team, that allowed us to actually get really good gains over, an athlete's off season or an athlete's career, and then allow us to continue to train hard in season. Um, and most of the time we were jumping our highest of the year, like November, early December, when we are going into the tournament, right? And I think that's a unique environment because, as you mentioned, most volleyball players have a really short timeline, right? If you're playing high school and club, for example, you basically don't have an off season. You're basically playing year round, right? You got a couple weeks here and there, but with tryouts and individuals and all of this other work that athletes are doing to try and get on a better club team, or try and improve what they're doing maybe on their high school team. Um, there's not a lot of time to actually train in the off season. So you have to train in season, right? And for me, like, it's evident, we know as strength and conditioning coaches and, for the physical performance side of things, it's evident that continuing to train during a competitive season is going to be beneficial either from a health and an injury standpoint or from a performance standpoint. So my approach for an athlete that's like that is pretty simple, right? We're going to try and do our best to actually get as much of the positive effects of training with as little of the negative effects and minimize any of the interference with the sport. So a lot of that is going to come down to what does the actual structure of their week look like, right? When are they playing? When are they practicing? How much are they traveling? If they're a youth athlete that is playing high school or club, then when are they going to school? When are they getting sleep? All of these sort of things that it's like we can just run athletes into the ground. That's easy actually to do. Um, but that's going to have a whole bunch of interference with things that actually matter, like skill, for example, right? And so to me, it's how do we manage at the weekly level and at the sort of like macro level, right? Where are we trying to end up and at what point, right? Is it towards the end of their club season? Is it a really short window between club and high school or vice versa, where, we're going to push a little harder here and back off there and all that sort of stuff. So again, it is pretty highly individualized, working with um, this, a PVF team, which is one of these new pro volleyball leagues. Um, for them, it's honestly, it's not vastly different from the weekly schedule that you might see in the NCAA. Their travel, frankly, isn't quite as good. And so we were pretty spoiled, at least in my experience, in terms of our travel. But for them, it's again just trying to manage um, and do as much as we can with managing sort of the interference effect of anything that we may be doing in the weight room, right? And again, I think it like it is, and I think it's improving. There is still so much talk around load management and frankly not enough talk about load tolerance, and one of those is much more reactive than proactive. And so for me, my approach has always been like, let's build as much tolerance as we can, right? Let's save up, deposit as much cash in the bank as we can so that when we have to make withdrawals, it doesn't kind of hurt as much in season, or it doesn't take as much away. And so that's really been my approach, uh, really for the last few years. But in particular, it's a challenge with a club volleyball athlete or an athlete in a PVF where that season, or that off season rather, is shortened. So you've got to really be uh, careful and intentional with what you're doing in season to try and maximize those.
Yeah, so definitely a lot easier from a collegiate standpoint.
Yeah,
Um,
in my experience, at least.
but in, like pre-college, high school club systems, it's really challenging. And that's kind of what I had alluded to, like seeing them go through high school, like they were on the go all the time. And, arguably like that's probably the most from a just overall physical standpoint where we're trying to build athletes, and it becomes really tough because you really have to pick and choose your timing and when we're chasing these physical qualities versus, like you said, like when are we just managing load and keeping them healthy and prioritizing what needs to happen on the court versus in the weight room. And so I think especially with a young athlete, like there's a lot of other variables that aren't as consistent like they are in college. So I'm sure you've got these girls who maybe from a high school standpoint were, like really good athletes, but then when they were a well structured, well monitored program yearly, you probably saw like performance and all these metrics just explode once they got into college.
Yeah, I think again, and consistency for me is like one of the biggest things, right? So that is what becomes challenging in season. Is sometimes it's easy enough to drop off what we're doing off court from a training perspective, and consistency sort of then becomes much more spotty, right? And so, um, I think at my time at Louisville, we were able to be very consistent training, in the weight room or training with me 3, 4, 5 days a week, potentially again from January basically to August. And so you do get this opportunity where you can make really massive gains. So we had some pretty big gains in both strength, but also, all of our jump metrics, whether that be touch height or, um, you know, uh, some specific force plate metrics, whatever that may be, right? And so, again, I think consistency is the biggest thing for that. If you don't have that opportunity, which I acknowledge that a lot of coaches don't, because I might just be working with high school or youth, volleyball athletes that are playing high school and club, and they don't have this really long window and they don't get to be super consistent. And so I guess in that instance, my approach is always to what is the to sort of ask, like, what is the lowest hanging fruit and what's going to be the most efficient or get us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of training, right? And what does that athlete really like? And I say this carefully, uh not to kind of throw any shade at the athlete, but like how invested are they actually, right? And what is their capacity to be invested, right? Like they don't have 6 days, 7 days to just train and go crazy and train and, hour and a half, 2, 3 hours every single day and go to school and do homework and do all of these things. And so you do have to pick and choose a little bit, right? And so I think having some principles that you can sort of fall back on and go, okay, you know what? This is what's going to be the most beneficial, right? This is what's going to be the most efficient. And this meets the athlete where they're at and it supports them in their goal. I think having that approach has been successful in the athletes that I've worked with. And in my experience has worked well. So, it's not always perfect. You don't get this massive off season and, uh, it is a bit messy and maybe training isn't ideal, but that's where I think we got to fall back to like what really, really matters in training and what do we know is going to have an impact and be supportive of that athlete's goal and their journey as an athlete.
You touched on it. Consistency in training is probably the biggest variable that we need to be focusing in with athletes from a year-long standpoint. And, I've only ever been in the private sector working with athletes. So unfortunately, we don't have the year-long exposure to our athletes. I mean, we're starting to develop that now at my facility. And, over the last 3 to 4 years, we keep chipping away and it keeps getting better and better. And our athletes are training in season more frequently. And of course, they're seeing better results year after year. Like it's not a coincidence. What are some of the conversations you have with athletes? You talked about buy-in and prioritizing in-season training. How are some of the things that, how are you talking to athletes that might struggle with understanding the importance of in-season training and getting them to really buy in and say, like, look, you're here, you want to get here, whether it's, skill wise, physically wise, professionally, like where you want to go. How are you talking to these athletes in order to gain that buy-in and that level of prioritization of in-season training?
Yeah, I mean, I think I, it's twofold, right? Like you have to have trust built with the athlete, and that comes down, that takes time, certainly. But there is also this aspect of just educating the athlete and really trying to have them understand why we're doing what we're doing, right? And then also explaining, look, like sort of preparing them for certain things. There are times when, look, if we have to train a little bit early in the season and we might be a little bit sore from that, but what that's going to allow us to do is then we won't be we because like to get all sciencey, right? With the repeated bout effect, we're going to be less sore the next time that we do that. And then that allows us to actually do more and be more consistent as we go throughout the season, right? And so I think for me, it is about educating the athlete, having conversations with them, right? And trying to get them to understand why we're doing things, right? And always trying to anchor these things to performance, right? That to me is really, really critical, right? And so understanding what the weight room can do for them, right? What a maybe a specific exercise, what this block of training, if we're really focused on, maybe these one or two specific qualities, how we want that or anticipate that to impact their performance. If we can help educate our athletes in that, I think it's a much easier conversation on, well, we need to do a bit of in-season training, right? We know that maybe this is going to make you a little bit sore, but where we place that training in the week it's going to be as far away from the match as possible so that we're going to try and mitigate any risk of you feeling flat or feeling sore when you actually have to play, because that's the most important thing. So again, I try and involve the athlete in the process as much as I can, right? Again, whether that be just as an educational point on why we're doing what we're doing, if they're going to be sore, how long should they be sore, if it's what are we going to do if it's not going as expected, but then also, right, involving them in the process of like, well, when is the best time for them to train? When do they, like, how are they feeling? Checking in with them almost constantly after they go on court during an in-season period and saying, "All right, how did we feel after that? Do we need to back off here? What adjustments do we need to make?" And I think that's really, really important is, again, trying to get really fast feedback from them, um, and make it as objective as possible, right? In a sense. And so that to me is has helped in many of those instances.
Yeah, always going back to the importance of communication. Like you said, you want these athletes to be their best coach, like their own advocate, and we can only do that and hope for that if we're giving them context as to why we're doing things, and again, seat at the table, right? Like you said, like they got to understand, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's how it's going to affect you as an athlete. Are you good with this, right? Like, is this something you can get on board with? And that often bodes well to long-term adherence and just consistency. So,
For sure. Yeah, and I think, like, again, I mentioned this earlier, but giving the athlete, um, some agency and autonomy in this process is so, so critical to your point of adherence and getting them to be more consistent. If they feel like, hey, whenever they really feel like a change should be made, or they know how this training is impacting them, right? And then they can be somewhat reflective because I've asked for feedback on how it's impacting them on court or on field or whatever that may be, right? Them having that autonomy and again being involved in the process, in my experience, has gone a long way to make sure that, again, the athlete is adherent because it's for them, right? It's their process. They're in the driver's seat, not me, right? And again, this has been for every level of athlete, right? This is the same way that I would treat a professional racing driver, a professional volleyball player, a collegiate player, or a high school or youth athlete. It doesn't matter to me what level they're at. This general process is going to be the same because, again, if I kind of fall back to like my first principles as a coach, is
yeah,
like I'm here to support them and I wanna make them involved in that process.
yeah. And I think given my experiences, I'm sure you're the same way, is like just the younger athletes struggle to, you know, communicate a little bit better. But right, like if we want them to be successful in sport, we need to start educating them on how to communicate with their respective coach, whether it's with us or when they go to college or if they're playing professionally. That's an important part of it, right? Like that's how you create longevity in a career. Is athletes need to be their best advocate and understand, they just can't be, their hand held the whole time. Like you said, agency and autonomy, like those are super important things as an athlete, to teach them that as soon as possible. That is going to give them a lot of success in the long run. So,
Yeah, and I also think as coaches, right, we can set them up for success in terms of them being able to communicate those things to us, right? And that is a process that can take some time to educate the athlete on, kinda guide them through like, how do they actually reflect on things better, right? And then communicate those things. So it's the questions that we ask as coaches, the follow-up questions that maybe we have, and allowing the athlete to kind of be somewhat exploratory in their reflection when they're giving me feedback on something, or how they're feeling about a situation, right? I don't want to plant this idea in their head of like, oh, this is how you should have felt, right? Right? Like, that's not going to, again, depending on the level of athlete or depending on the personality of that athlete, they may lean into that and just kind of agree with me. And I don't, that's not really helpful for me because that just feeds my own bias. And so I really want to try and, again, be very intentional with how I'm communicating to an athlete, and, you know, really, again, trying to give them agency in that process.
I love that. So you had touched on something specifically with your volleyball players, the evolution of like jump heights and force plate testing and all that type of stuff. I think if you look 5, 10 years ago, like traditional strength and conditioning for like jumpers and court sport athletes, like it was like I've seen the evolution of how people are training those individuals immensely in the last 5 to 10 years. That was one of the conversations I had with Jamie as we discussed. But um, what are some of the things that you're doing for those jumpers and those, court sport athletes that like outside of like traditional um S&C, like that has kind of evolved your ability to coach those athletes and build elasticity and jump heights and power and development all with those athletes?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think it's somewhat dependent on, right, like what conventional training is or isn't. I think a lot of coaches can get a bit overzealous with the complexity of their training and making weight room exercises uber specific to anything, not just jumping, right? And it's not that those methods or things can't or like don't work. But it is more of a question on like, is it necessary or appropriate at that time, right? And I've worked with some athletes that we've done some very complex training, right? But it's been on the back end of really simple training for maybe a really long and consistent, right? That'll be the word of the day, consistency over a long period of time, right? And so, some of the things that I have found that have worked well, and this is we can kind of really go two ways with this is like what we found at Louisville is that our athletes that had lower body strength values of 1.7 times their body weight typically jumped higher, right? And so there is this thought process of like, I've just got to drive strength through the ceiling as much as I can and 2 times body weight, 2 times body weight. And that really, in a lot of the research, but also anecdotally in the field, I think is not necessarily holding true anymore. What I've seen in my own practice is that it's about 1.6 to 1.7 is there's a little bit of wiggle room there, kind of depending on the group of the population. And then they're them being able to kind of jump higher from that. So once we kind of make it to that point, right? Or if we're under that level or that threshold, that is typically the bigger focus, right? Is we should just drive strength up because as I mentioned, like the simple methods are and what is the most efficient? Well, the most efficient way that we have seen is that we just want to get that strength value up. Once we're there, then it was always a question of, okay, how much time do we have left with the athlete? If they're a freshman, right, and they squat 1.7 times their body weight, well, we probably can start to implement some more specific methods of training, right? But do we need to? Because they might have 4 or 5 years with us in the collegiate environment, or if it's a youth athlete, congratulations if you've got a 15-year-old kid that squats 1.7 times their body weight. That's awesome, I guess. But like, I'm not going to go give that 15-year-old kid French contrast because or some other very complex method because it's not necessary for them to continue to improve, right? What would be more beneficial is take any of that extra time and go spend it on skill work probably. Um, and so for me, I guess some of the more complex methods that we have done is take force plate metrics, start to derive strategy and kind of once the athlete has met that threshold of 1.6 or 1.7 times their body weight, then we can deep dive into a force plate metric or a handful of force plate metrics and try and understand their strategy and what is going to be sort of optimal, right, for them, and then how can we influence that, whether that be, eccentric rate of force development, or is it, that they need a bit more sort of like heavy power versus lighter power work or whatever that may be, right? And so that's how we uh, typically would break training up for certain types of the year, right? So over certain times of the year. And so, we may have a period in which, if we've got 15 volleyball players, for example, we there might be 8 of them that haven't met that strength threshold, so they're gonna do a very strength-focused work, or maybe they're young, and so that is gonna be sort of like bucket 1. Then in bucket 2, we might have a group that has met that strength threshold, but their jump strategy and what we feel like might improve their jump, their output metrics, right, is gonna be one type of training, and then there's gonna be another bucket that is gonna be, maybe a little more force dominant versus velocity dominant, and so, I think that is typically how we used horse plates, from a performance, standpoint and trying to drive training, but also, again, that would be complex methods for us, right? We're not doing these crazy uh, French contrast, and I just keep coming back to that one. That's the one that's stuck in my head
Yeah.
today, apparently. But we're not doing a whole lot of that because it's like it's just not necessary. It's more like how are we going to, do a specific exercise? So I mentioned, those two groups that are really focused on they've met their strength threshold. They might both be still doing squat jumps, but it's like how are they doing that squat jump, for example?
Yeah. That framework makes a ton of sense. I think every strength coach who's worked with athletes long enough, lowest hanging fruit in the beginning of their training age, right? Like we got to get them stronger, right? Like that's always going to be for most young athletes and underdeveloped athletes, that's going to be their limiting factor is their ability to produce force. And then there's going to be a point in time where they're strong enough and like chasing more strength is probably just not worth the stress and the byproducts of that. Especially when we're working with more elite athletes. And then it becomes like, all right, now how do we continue to drive adaptation? Now, you use, you say you use force plate data and things like that to kind of track like, do you bucket athletes into like different archetypes, right? Like there's so many different ways of doing that. Like I know the initial one was like your kangaroos and your gorillas. Now it's, narrow versus wide ISAs and things like that. And obviously people are biased into, you know, certain types of movement patterns and things like that. Do you kind of utilize that infrastructure in your bucketing as you kind of branch off from that level, like that 1.7 and beyond?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you can go down the rabbit hole on like there's a million ways to bucket athletes now,
Yeah.
right? And it's like
Yeah.
I almost can't keep up. So it's to me it was always like, okay, what does from an objective standpoint, right? What metrics from a force plate that we're pulling off, which ones are valid, right? And that we actually understand, right? Because if you take something, some of, I just won't name force plate companies, but there's two kind of big players, right? And they're both really good, but you have, you know, the one that I'm most experienced in, you get a ton of metrics back, right? Now, all of those metrics, if you think you're going to use all of those, is like you're good luck. I mean, I'll see you next year. You can sift through 1 week of jumps and over the next 6 months and figure that out. But to me, it was always like, all right, what metrics are going to be valid? How do we bucket those? Whether those are more sort of output metrics like a, takeoff velocity or a jump height or something like that, right? And then what is the athlete's strategy, right? And um, you know, then what are metrics that maybe underpin some of those things, right? So to me, it was never like these buckets of, what ISA or are you a kangaroo or a gorilla or, anything like that. It was very much we know these metrics are valid coming off of coming from the force plate. We know they're reliable as well. We've got a large set of data that is going to allow us to actually make a decision. We didn't just jump 3 times and then start making decisions from it. We jumped for a year, right? And we've got, 3 jumps or more every single week for a really long period of time. And we felt comfortable making decisions from that because we knew what the errors were in some of those metrics. And so what is going to be actual change in those? And so for me, that is kind of what inform the decision making rather than just these archetypes of, uh,
Absolutely.
bucketing athletes, based on, their anatomy or how their,
Yeah.
the shape of their torso or whatever, like, I mean, that stuff's good and well. But to me, there is a lot of that stuff comes in vogue for a period of
Yeah.
time, and it goes out
Yeah.
of vogue, right? And uh, it's not as objective, right, or
Absolutely.
valid as we want it to be.
Yeah. I think if now if you don't have force plate data to go off of, I think that's a relatively good way of maybe addressing like the buckets
Sure.
of where your athletes are and maybe what their biggest limiting factor is.
Yeah.
And they always say like in a typical off season, you're trying to build up those weaknesses, and in a typical in season, you're trying to maintain their strengths, right? Um, and so, what are some of like maybe some of the key metrics that you guys felt as like pertinent information that all right, I'm honing in on these. Like, is it if you said takeoff velocity? Is it some athletes from their strategy of moving, like some athletes drop at a deeper squat and need more time to create force, whereas some are more elastic and their jump looks on a force plate data as well as visibly like completely different. What are some of the things that you guys kind of tracked on a regular basis to monitor those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the easiest one, right, and this is the one that we would often, not exclusively, but often report to the athletes, was like, "Did you jump higher? Did you jump faster?" Those things are very quick to, that's a really easy thing to say, "Hey, Sean, you jumped higher than you did, last week or maybe the last 3 trials or last 3 times that we've done this, or you jumped faster," or whatever that may be, right? And then if we're starting to sort of look at strategy, we may be looking at things like, the counter movement depth or the eccentric duration, for example, and really trying to understand how the athlete achieved that. Because again, if my jump height didn't change, but my counter movement depth went down, I'm having to do more in theory to get that same level of output. So then that leads me to ask maybe other questions and sort of find some other metrics that are maybe underpinning that, like different measures of force, whether that be eccentric, uh, you know, eccentric braking force, or force at zero velocity, whatever that may be. And so again, it is a where I tried to make it a very nuanced approach of, like, it isn't just this one metric. We've got a couple that sort of uh, tick a domino over, and once that domino's ticked over, it's going to ask, that might lead me to ask another question, and then another question, and try and sort of parse out what's actually happening here. But I would also say that we didn't make these really big overcorrections a lot of the time,
Yes.
right? And one of the things that I'll say, and so that we're not just talking about force plates, because I acknowledge that not everybody has them, right? And
Yeah.
honestly, even right now for me, I don't have them, right?
Yeah.
So I'm working, most of the volleyball players that I work with right now are remote to me, right? I support them remotely, and so we don't always have access to force plates, and sometimes they do if they happen to be training at their university, or maybe their pro team has one or something like that. But most of the time they don't have access to force plates, right? And so what do we do if we don't have them? Well, you can look at things like the ratio of just a standing block touch and a spike touch, right? With an approach, right? And then understanding that in conjunction to their strength level, and understanding, okay, is this an actual, like, jumping problem, or is this a problem with their approach? Do we need to work on their approach technique, right, and start to improve that? Because jumping is a skill, right, and it is a skill that can be learned and improved upon. And so, how do we sort of parse out what matters when we don't have a lot of these really sort of, uh, I say higher level, right? Higher level pieces of tech, like a force plate, or a device that can measure some of these things.
Yeah, and I ask because this is something that we as a facility we're integrating more and more in our training methodology. But I really like the comment you made that like it didn't force any like major overcorrections with your training. Um, a friend of mine who like when I first started getting into the stuff, he talked about how like sports science is it's more or less just you're collecting trends to see if it's validating what you're doing from a training standpoint is working, right? It's not like, oh, you're down or you're up this week, so we're going to completely change course. It's no, is what I've programmed over time doing what I want it to do. And now that might influence how I address and iterate and audit my training philosophy over the long run. But it's not like, hey, this was down, so we're changing everything up next week. Like that's not what sports science should be. Would you agree that that's kind of how you guys utilize it in your setting as well?
Man, I love it. I love it. Strength and condition. So strength and condition. You get me on a rant here. Strength and conditioning coaches don't audit themselves enough.
Yes.
Honestly, it's really easy to pat myself on the back and say, "Oh yeah, my athletes got stronger or they got faster." Well, okay. How are you measuring their speed? Did we actually get faster? Or are we cherry picking certain times of the year? So when I worked with softball or baseball, we tried to do, that we tried to increase the frequency of our testing so that we understood what I mentioned this earlier, like what is the error in that test? Because if I cherry pick when I'm going to do speed testing for the first day, I come back after a break, and then after I've done a block of training, and then I make sure that everybody feels really good.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, like all of my
Yeah.
60 times got way better just now. It's
Yeah.
like, all right, well, did why did they get better?
Yep.
Right? Is it because we just happen to feel a little bit better or we feel really good and we're not detrained in our post testing? So I think auditing what you're doing as a professional and as a practitioner is massively important. This is absolutely how we used force plates, right? I mentioned this earlier, right? We had one group that kind of did just your very general strength work. And then we had a more advanced group. And that advanced group sometimes was focused on, let's say, we were going to really focus on some eccentric qualities, right? That we felt like are going to impact jump performance. Well, I'm going to try some things in training and I'm going to measure as much as I can from a frequency standpoint and see what actually happened, right? Because if I don't, and I just tell myself that, man, that was a really cool program, and subjectively the athletes feel a bit better or springier, like that is good. I do want to know that athletes are feeling good. But if it actually didn't do anything, if they've got the same that they're scoring the exact same in week 1 and as they are 8 weeks later, it's like, is there a simpler way to do that program? Why didn't it work? Again, I mentioned this earlier, like it ticks a domino, and then we can start asking questions, which maybe lead to more questions. And so, for me, I feel really strongly about this. As you can tell, I'm getting fired up here because I think strength and conditioning coaches is it's so easy to hide behind, right? Just going, oh yeah, we're stronger, or oh yeah, we're faster, or we jumped a bit higher, or whatever, like this singular outcome metric may be. And it's not that that stuff's not useful, but like, did we actually audit properly what we've done over the course of the off season? All right. One of the things that we did for a handful of teams that I worked with at Louisville was really deep dive availability, right? Not just injury trends, because again, whether I'm in or out, if I'm in and available, but I can only do half the drills. Well, that matters to me as a practitioner, right? How long was I doing that? Because that's going to influence the, reconditioning from, or a return process or whatever it may be. So not only should we be kind of just focused on what we as strength and conditioning coaches are doing, but I think there's an opportunity to audit as a health and performance unit for a team, right? We can do a much better job of auditing injuries and understanding, the burden that those injuries may have, right? So I'm all about auditing what we're doing as practitioners, but I also want to audit what we're doing as a team, and ensuring that like we're doing everything that we can and being proactive and understanding, right? When are we getting injured? Why are we getting injured? How long does that take us to get back? What is the burden of that? Are there certain hot spots in the year that we can actually kind of proactively try and tackle? And then that influences what we or should influence what we're doing from a training perspective as well, right? Volleyball is a perfect example, at least in my experience, of if you go and just pull the NCAA data, or at least when I did this a few years ago, when you go and just pull the NCAA data, it's all ACL and ankle injuries. Well, we at the time had for a couple of years basically no time loss for either of those things, right? But we did have tendon and bone, right? And so it was like, okay, well, why is that? And what can we do about those things and try and mitigate that risk? Obviously, we can't prevent injuries as a whole, but there are things that we could do to try and improve this. And again, it's not just me as the strength and conditioning coach, it's bringing in the dietitian or nutritionist, it's getting sports medicine involved, it's trying to work with our coaches and our athletes on this entire process. And again, that's why I say I think a lot of people, I mentioned this earlier, a lot of people talk about being holistic, and that's a nice buzzword and it sounds great, but you really when you actually are holistic, you can have really good impact, right?
Yeah, and it's getting back to the whole auditing, I think it's an important part of your evolution as a strength coach, right? Like I look at how I train athletes is I wouldn't say significantly different, but there's a lot of differences based on when I first started as a strength coach almost 18, 20 years ago. And so, but it's because like I look at what I've done every year, right? I use periods of the time where like, if you're working with athletes, which I have for over a decade, then that same athlete, like you better change what you're doing. You have to adjust what you're doing for that athlete because they change, their body changes, their their um their adaptation to stress is different. So I think that becomes like now as you work with elite athletes, like you have to start looking at these little nuanced details and what you didn't have to do when they were younger, young developing athletes where like they just needed to get strong. But a veteran playing 13 years in the big league, like what they need at this point is vastly different than what they needed, 15 years ago. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, I don't I know who I heard the quote from, which is Sean Mishka. I don't know where he actually got the quote from, but there's this quote that's like, "A man never steps in the same river twice," something along those lines, right? And it's like every single offseason, that athlete is gonna be slightly different, right? Or I'm gonna be slightly different, or our timeline of things is gonna be different. Some variable will have changed. So I think you hit the nail on the head there in that, like, we should constantly be auditing what we're doing and not just regurgitating the same early off-season program every single year. And this is what starts us. This is what's going to start my baseball off-season in August every year, right? Is this same 4-week block. Well, that's great. I'm glad that worked for you at one point, but are we intentionally, sort of like deploying that program and implementing it, or are we just doing it because it worked once and we haven't really audited whether it's continued to work?
well, look, I have a few more questions. These are quicker, more like rapid fire, but you know, I've been doing this for a long time. I've had a lot of influences. What would you say? What or whom have been your biggest influence as your role as a strength coach?
Man, total cop out answer. Honestly, the athletes, right? Like
I
the
like that.
athletes have, right? Like those are, and they continue to be the most influential people for me because I learn the most from them about what they're doing, which then impacts what I do. And so I think that is probably you know, again, kind of continually the most influential thing. In terms of just other practitioners, um, I absolutely have to give a shout out to Dan Howells and what he's doing at Collaborate Sports. I think, I've worked with Dan in a mentorship capacity, uh, I don't know, for 5 years now or something like that. And he has been one of the most influential individuals that I've had on my career. And I would also be, um, you know, for me, I would say Tina Murray, who hired me originally at the University of Louisville, is also really, really influential. She's the one that kind of got me, I would say, kickstarted in my collegiate career in a sense. I'd done a little bit elsewhere, but um, what she did at Louisville at that time and how it's still, you know, pretty much just run that process is still heavily, that program's still heavily influenced by that process today. You know, what she's done from a process standpoint, I think has made a hell of a difference for me in how I think about things. So I would say those two individuals are really up there for me in terms of other practitioners and other people that have mentored me over the years.
in the strength and conditioning world right now, what excites you the most?
Oh man. Strength and conditioning. What excites me the most
Or
is,
just performance development in this umbrella?
yeah, man, skill acquisition is
Love it.
where, in motor learning, right? I think that's been something that, for me in particular, over the last year or so, um, is where I've spent a lot of my time in terms of professional development and trying to improve my knowledge. And so I absolutely have to give a shout out to the guys at Emergent for that, and Emergence Movement. Man, those guys are next level. They're not the only ones out there, but they are really, really good, and they've consolidated quite a lot of knowledge from many of the researchers in that space. And so I think motor learning and skill acquisition is um, kind of the next thing that, from a performance standpoint, a human performance standpoint, there's massive opportunity for strength and conditioning coaches, sports science, sport coaches, technical, tactical, whoever, to really kind of start to bridge the gap on what actually influences performance. And so that for me is absolutely where my head's at lately.
I can appreciate that given the athletes that I work with, skill acquisition is, that's what connects all of our work in the weight room to the field, right? If they're not applying it and understanding how to learn movement and just learn how to move it more efficiently, that's huge. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and what's next for you, brother?
Man, keep chipping away. Enjoy San Diego as much as I
Yes.
can while
Yeah.
I'm here. We never know what's next. So for me, while I'm 10 minutes from the beach and it's sunny and 70 pretty much year round, I'm going to enjoy that as much as I can, and just continue to support the athletes that I have the privilege of working with and supporting. And so, um, yeah, man, I think just it's always interesting to go from, again, a very traditional full-time role where I'm embedded you know, in the facility, whether that's the weight room or the office or whatever, kind of day in and day out, to working primarily remotely, which is what I'm doing now. But that to me offers its own kind of uh, handful of opportunities, which is a lot of time on professional development for me. So I'm excited to kind of chip away at that and continue to learn.
Awesome. Well, if people do want to work with you, where can they find you?
Man, well, I have the worst name for social media of all time, Sean Smith. I know about 5 more of them, so I've had to get very creative on my Twitter, or X now, which is HP underscore coach underscore Sean, or Instagram is much easier. I somehow lucked out and just got Sean Smith Coaching. So uh, either of those are great. And then again, I somewhat got lucked out on my email, which I'm happy to share if anybody wants to message me or shoot me an email, which is smithperformancecoaching at gmail.com. So any of those, I'm happy to respond and talk shop with anybody, or help out in any way that I can.
Awesome. Well, this has been great, Sean. Really nice to catch up with you, and I appreciate your time and being very generous in speaking with us today.
Yeah, man, I appreciate the opportunity, and always good to talk shop with somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for tuning in to this episode of the MTB Performance Project. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe the show. That helps us grow the audience and allows us to continue to bring in more guests like Sean. Thanks, brother.
Thank you. Have a great day.